We are delighted to welcome you to this Nexia webinar session, European E-Invoicing Trends, Insights for Financial Executives. For those who don't know, Nexia operates in over 120 countries via more than 230 member firms. We are experts in middle market assurance, advisory and tax services, and as the title of this session suggests, we can help by offering support and guidance to ensure that your business is compliant with e-invoicing rules, as well as providing advice on how to improve business processes. For more information, please do get in touch with your local Nexia firm using www.nexia.com. However, speaking of local member firms, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have Nick Hart, a director from Saffery in the UK, joining us. We have Tobias Barkschart, a manager from Nexia GmbH from Germany. We have Salvatore Tarsia, a partner at TCFCT Studio Associatio from Italy. We also have Slavomir Patayuk, all the way a partner from Advicero Nexia, all the way from Poland. And so, without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Nick Hart from Saffery.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on e-invoicing, electronic invoicing. So this really is the hot topic in international indirect taxes currently. There are a vast number of countries that are seeking to implement some form of e-invoicing over the next few years, as well as numerous countries that have already implemented it. It's not necessarily a new concept, though, and companies in a number of jurisdictions have had the ability to issue electronic invoices in an acceptable format, other than sort of traditional hard copy, for many years. But so, what is all the excitement about now in terms of e-invoicing? Why is it high on the indirect tax agenda? So the trend now is for tax authorities to implement mandatory e-invoicing, that an actual obligation to issue electronic invoices. And involved in that, a key element of that, and a predominant feature of mandatory e-invoicing systems, is real-time or near real-time transactional reporting to the tax authorities. So in a number of cases where e-invoicing is being implemented or considering to be implemented, that goes hand in hand with almost a move away from the traditional VAT return of totals being filled in a number of boxes, and it's just the totals being reported to the tax authorities. What we see now is actual transactional data being reported on a real-time or near real-time basis in many cases. So the tax authorities have actual visibility over the kind of background transactional data to which the e-invoices relate. So it's all kind of this e-invoicing, e-reporting processes, and the move to that for a whole number of reasons. And then the challenge for businesses is really to stay up to date with what is being proposed in their home countries and in the countries in which they operate in. The implementation landscape, it's fair to say, is moving rapidly, with lots of new announcements almost weekly in some cases, but also moving sort of go live dates and implementation dates. So tax authorities will often announce a date or a year in which they aim to have this implemented, and that is subject to some changes as they realise that businesses perhaps need more time to prepare and for technology to be in place, because the technology behind this is the real key. If the technology underpinning these new processes is not robust and fit for purpose, then it won't be a successful implementation. But for clearly businesses, the implications for not being ready for e-invoicing requirements are significant, not least from an indirect tax compliance perspective, so ensuring that you're making the right submissions at the right time in terms of new e-reporting standards, but also from a commercial perspective. So if you're not ready for mandatory e-invoicing, you're going to have issues with billing your clients and collecting your fees, etc. So real critical commercial impact. Next slide. So it's unsurprising in this day and age that tax authorities are turning to technology to create more efficient compliance processes, but also to have greater control over indirect tax collection. It's very much a case that fraud has been and continues to be a big issue in indirect tax systems, in VAT systems, and legislators are always seeking ways to reduce the instance of fraud and close the tax gap. So we'll come back to the tax gap, or the VAT gap, in a second. So many jurisdictions. So this is a global kind of a global trend to move towards e-invoicing and e-reporting. Many jurisdictions actually have had it for a number of years. The likes of Argentina, Mexico, and South Korea, as mentioned on the slide there, and they've successfully implemented this. And this is very much part of their day-to-day business and indirect tax reporting, e-invoicing and e-reporting. And then many more countries, as I've mentioned, have this on the horizon. So it's not necessarily just a European or EU thing. It is very much global. So which is what, you know, companies operating on a global basis have their work cut out for them to an extent, and to keep up to date with everything that's going on here in the countries in which they operate. Next slide. And so, from the perspective of the EU, so I mentioned the VAT gap. So the VAT gap is effectively the difference between VAT that should have been reported and collected, and what was actually reported and collected by the tax authorities. And studies suggest that reducing the VAT gap and reductions that have been seen recently in the EU are largely down to the digitisation of tax systems, real-time reporting transactions, and e-invoicing in those jurisdictions that have already implemented it. So tax authorities see a real benefit to this, with that whole aim of collecting the VAT that's actually due, and reducing fraud. And some of my fellow presenters today will touch upon this as well. Within the EU, on the horizon, there is VIDA, the VIDA reforms, VAT in the digital age, and one of the measures, or several measures within VIDA, relates to e-invoicing and digital reporting across the EU. The official deadline for which the implementation deadline is being pushed back, and continues to be. However, single EU countries, so separate individual member states, are implementing e-invoice and e-reporting regardless of the VIDA deadlines. So we'll hear later from my fellow presenters with respect to Italy and Poland to see what's happening specifically there. But there on the slide is just an indication of which member states are looking to introduce mandatory e-invoicing over the next few years. Next slide. So within Nexia, we recently undertook a survey of member firms with respect to e-invoicing. And so just some takeaways from that. If we can just pop over to the next slide, just for the graphical representation of some of these points. So 70% of respondents indicated that one of the main features of the new e-invoicing implementation in their countries was real-time or near real-time reporting to tax authorities. So that's the kind of transactional data being submitted to tax authorities, as opposed to just kind of box totals on the normal monthly or quarterly VAT returns where applicable. So now we're seeing actual transactional data being submitted as part of the compliance process. Interestingly, it's not necessarily domestic transactions that will be caught, only domestic transactions that will be caught by e-invoicing requirements, and 88% of respondents said in their jurisdictions it will also apply to cross-border. And there's also quite a high instance of cases where it also apply to B2C. Perhaps think B2B is the more obvious supply channel for e-invoicing, but also B2C e-invoicing requirements are being considered. A couple of other points from that survey, one in particular, is the idea of reconciliation of transactions in a database operated by the tax authority. So e-reporting in many cases will involve this behind-the-scenes reconciliation of basic sales transactions reported by a supplier against the purchase transactions from the customer, with the output tax and input tax being reconciled off. So it's that kind of measure that is seeking to counteract the instances of fraud within a VAT system. Final slide from myself for now, just moving on to just some benefits, probably largely from a tax authority perspective, some concerns and perhaps risks. So we just put some pluses on there. So tax authorities would be better informed. They'll be more able to conduct investigations more efficiently, obviously a benefit for them. Real-time monitoring of invoices and returns would allow for inaccuracies and issues to be resolved, reducing time spent on audits and investigations, etc., and a reduction in sort of the administrative burden in the case of chasing up invoices. Concerns and risks, largely from a business perspective, likely to be quite complex from an SME perspective in terms of implementation, perhaps potentially costly in terms of additional training for teams, software that may be required. And perhaps the biggest concern is perhaps a lack of clarity in terms of guidance and the kind of the implementation dates being rather fluid at the moment. So we also undertook an external survey that was part of the registration process for this particular webinar, and thank you for those that responded to that. Just one takeaway from that was that 80% of respondents indicated that they were concerned or very concerned by the implementation of e-invoicing from a mandatory e-invoicing from the perspective of appropriate guidance being available, but also relatively short timeframes to implement changes. So that's it for myself. I'm going to hand you over to Tobias from Nexia GmbH, who will talk a little bit about what's happening in Germany.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for your introduction. So let me start with my thoughts on the e-invoicing when Nick asked me to present about the current German point of view. So since we don't have a wider introduced e-invoicing system yet, I will make clear the main advantages and risk on the topic first, and then before getting back on the actually already implied B2G e-invoicing rules. So let's start with my first slide. As we can see, and already Nick told us, the VAT gap amounts to 60 billion euro in all member states, but not less than 7.5 billion euro are allocated to Germany according to the EU Commission. So I thought 7.5 billion might be a huge number, but the German federal budget lack of 60 billion taught me better. So the German government requires financial matters of 1 year VAT fraud. But to take this 60 billion in mind, I guess that the fraud or the criminal activities for drugs, for example, are not included in that amount. So therefore, the lack might be much higher. So as you can see on the right side, the VAT carousel and the missing trader might be the main problem of the VAT gap in the EU. So normally the input VAT deduction depending on the received invoice, and the invoice requirements needs to be checked from the recipient. But the corresponding VAT payment from the providing company could not be validated by the recipient. And that's the problem for the tax authorities, because if the recipient of the invoices checked the normal invoice requirements, that recipient should be entitled to claim back input VAT. But the fraudster, so the performing company, might be one seat behind in the carousel, don't intend to pay that VAT amount which was issued on the invoice to the German tax authorities. And that's why the VAT gap exists in general. So additionally, the timing gap between the VAT payment and the input VAT deduction due to different filing periods increases that problem. So if the performing company has to file its VAT returns on a quarterly basis, but the recipient of the invoices claims its input VAT on a monthly basis, there is a 2-month gap where the tax authorities are not able to check whether the VAT amount has actually paid. So on the next slide, we see that the e-invoicing implementation should include, on the one hand, real-time transmission to tax authorities, and on the other hand, the obligation for electronic invoice transmissions. So the electronic invoice transmission should be the more easy part, as only the German VAT law or the EU VAT directive should be amended, and that should not be a big deal, also not for the companies. But the real-time transmission to tax authorities have a higher value on that e-invoicing procedure itself. So the missing trader fraud could be identified before the invoice reaches the customer or purchaser, if there is a background check on all invoices issued. And if the supplier, for example, is not registered for VAT purposes in Germany, no input VAT deduction on the recipient side would be possible. And the real-time check requires specific system regulations we currently don't have in Germany, but perhaps in some other countries. So the artificial intelligence could identify new fraud tries based on unusual transaction and proceedings. So deviations could be identified through the German tax offices already, but on a smaller frame. So for example, for income tax purposes, if there are some unusual proceedings, a red flag will attend, and then it's easy for the tax officer to check it separate. So, but with artificial intelligence, the surveillance methods might change in future. But on the dark side of that medal, deeper monitoring on all transactions based on sectors could be threatened of data theft. Especially if we consider that the theft of confidential data relating to purchase prices, for example, be the new business of former VAT carousel fraudsters. Yeah, probably. So, but for the honest companies, there's also an advantage, as the incorrect issued invoices could be identified directly. So later correction workload could be minimized in that regard. And more standard invoicing regulations save company capacities as well. But on the other side, filled invoice figures nevertheless could be incorrect or incomplete. So for example, the invoice date or the performing company, the tax number could be validated from the system. But if the transferred goods, for example, are wrong or not really transferred, that could not be checked with the e-invoicing procedure. So on the next slide, we can look to the current situation in the EU and in Germany. So according to Nick's part, there is no final e-invoicing legislation in the EU VAT directive, but the VIDA suggestions are published in December 2022. There's no corresponding framework conditions so far. So, but to introduce it, we require that framework a few years upfront. And the original date to implement e-invoicing was in 2028, and now it might be postponed. So at the moment, according to Article 218, it is only entitled to issue e-invoices, but there's no obligation to file it electronically. And on the recipient side, according to Article 232, you require an approval from the recipient of the electronic format. And that's the same thing we have in Germany at the moment. So if the recipient of your invoice asks for a printed invoice sent by a regular mail, you have to print it. Article 395 provides member states stricter regulations to fight VAT fraud. And Germany finally got the permission from the Council of the EU for the e-invoicing obligation this year. It should be valid as of 1st January 25, but nobody is sure if the date becomes the real implementation date, as there are so many questions left to be declared upfront. And it should be applicable for domestic supplies and B2B only. I'm not sure why it's restricted to B2B, as also B2C invoices maybe could be included if everybody has their email account today. But the reason to do it domestic only might be sufficient, in my opinion, as cross-border transactions are mainly VAT exempt. So the risk of fraud might be smaller for cross-border transactions. So intra-community supplies, export supplies are mostly VAT exempt anyways. So, but finally, we have one implemented e-invoicing system, and it is a B2G, or for B2G cases, as we can see on the next slide. It have been implemented in November 2020 for business to government transactions to federal authorities or state authorities in Germany. And there's a net amount of 1,000 euros threshold. The processing or data processing should be proceeded with XML form. And there are currently 2 filing platforms which are to be used, depending on the recipient of the supply or of the service. So if you perform services to a federal authority, you might need the ZRE filing platform. But if you also perform to state authorities, you also need to register for the OZGRE filing platform. So we don't know how it's going on if there is a B2B e-invoicing system in Germany. Maybe you need to register for 3 or more filing platforms to fulfill your the requirements. The transmission could be proceeded via uploading every single invoice or using an external provider and prepare Excel files that might be changed to the XML form. However, as already said, the validation of formal requirements could be proceeded with that platforms, but the content could not be checked. So if the mentioned products are incorrect, for example, the invoice nevertheless is wrong and does not allow to deduct input VAT. And only if the formal requirements are fulfilled, the invoice will be provided or forwarded to the recipient afterwards. Now on my final slide, we saw that there are lots of requirements to be considered from a technical view, and the EU-wide regulations might be helpful to implement it in Germany, especially if we have just a particular time frame for the German solution for 3 years, or probably for 4 or 5 years. If the system has to be amended completely, it might be very affordable for the companies. So the amendments in German VAT law are necessary, but that's a smaller thing to be considered. And the time frame was already criticized as too short-term, especially for smaller companies, if it should be proceeded in 1 year. From a VAT fraud perspective, the e-invoicing combined with the real-time transmission of invoices might prevent missing trader fraud, but there's still no practical solution in sight. So I'm looking forward to the suggestions of the German VAT law development in short-term future. and will hand over to Salvatore now for the Italian part. Thanks.
Thank you, Tobias, for your introduction. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what happened in Italy, also because we already introduced the e-invoicing already in 2015 from B2G. But the big revolution in terms of the invoicing happened on the 1st January of 2019, when Italy generally applied the issuing of the invoices for both sale of goods and sale of services, for both B2B, so between the VAT subject, and as well B2C, also business to consumer. In all cases, from 2019, the issuer and the recipient of the invoices should have been Italian resident subjects. Not nowadays, because nowadays it's not important that the client is Italian or not Italian. But at that time, I mean, the client, it was mandatory only for only in case the recipient was Italian. The story is a bit long journey. I mean, the European directive the European directive of 2006 put the paper and electronic invoices on an equal footing, and leaving the invoices as an optional, as is going to happen also in other countries, even nowadays, and also Tobias was saying. And it was just an optional for the companies to opt out to the new invoicing system. Only on May 2017, I mean, the European Commission sent out a document to Italy recommending the use of the invoicing in order to allow the greater traceability of payments, especially given the low use of the electronic payment system and the high evasion. So the Italian government therefore requested a derogation from VAT directive, which stipulated the invoicing should be an optional. And in addition to the objective to combating the evasion, the Italian request was motivated to believe that the invoice could accelerate the digitization process of the Italian company, and thus reduce also the administrative and tax compliance costs. And I have to say that this happened because nowadays, I mean, the digitization process is more important compared to the past. Around the EU country, Italy has been the first country in EU in adopting the e-invoicing. So as you can see, on 2015, I mean, Italy applied the invoicing only on B2G to the public with transaction with the public administration. In 2018, it was just for sale of petrol, diesel, automotive, and some to some non-EU travelers. The big revolution happened on 1st January 2019, when the e-invoicing applies on a general basis from both B2B, B2C. And there's another important change happened on the 1st of July 2022, when also the foreign customer have been, I mean, when the invoicing was toward the foreign customer, should have been already applied, I mean, the invoicing. And as well, also there are, they applied the invoicing also to those subjects that are having a special regimes, especially like a forfeit or with a turnover in excess over 25,000 euro. Next slide, please. The invoicing system obliges people in managing their transaction that gives rise to invoicing entirely by computer, avoiding the printing of physical copy. But also before the invoicing, the issuing of the invoice was in paper, and it was managed entirely by computer, but in a different way. For example, you can create the PDF or the Word and send directly to the client via email. Nowadays, you don't do that. You don't send, or you can send what we call a courtesy copy to the client. But what we have to do is to create a file in XML formats that is sent, that obviously that is compliant with all the technical specification indicated by the law, and it's sent to the web portal, to the STI, Sistema di Interscambio, that is the tax office, system, that delivers, checks the invoices and delivers. Next slide, please. How you can prepare and receive the invoice. The agency revenue, made available 3 different, options in order to use a free of charge systems for creating and for creating the invoicing. It can be a web procedure or software downloaded on PC or app or tablets, for tablets or smartphone. But I have to say that the majority of the companies in Italy that use this system directly on the web portal of the agency revenue, but they buy, other software prepared by private companies, because also they can be more integrated in the ERP systems of the client, or they provide additional services. And for example, our firm, we don't use the system, provided by the agency revenue. We buy, a software that is customized for tax firms, so that we can manage, the e-invoicing, and also we can assist clients by providing additional services to them. Next slide. The electronic invoicing must be always to be sent through, as I said, to the SCI, the interchange system. Otherwise, the invoice is considered not issued. In the past, you can send the invoice via email, PDF, it can be an attachment, and you can send by post. If you don't send it through the SDI, the invoice doesn't exist. And so the SDI is like a postman. So at the beginning of the introduction of the invoicing, of the e-invoice in 2018, every single VAT registered subject should have a recipient code or a PAC address. PAC is the certified email address, further than the VAT. So it was a big mess, a big revolution, but also a big mess, I have to say, at the beginning in 2019, in order to be compliant with all these new rules. It's very important to check that invoice. When you raise an invoice, it's very important that you check that it's sent correctly, delivered to the recipient. Otherwise, the invoice is deemed like non-issued. Wherever it is read on PDF or another format, this is not an invoice anymore. Next slide. So once the electronic invoice has been sent to the STI carries out some checks on the correctness on the invoicing of the invoice. The timing, which is the STI carries out the invoice control and delivery operation, can vary from a few minutes to maximum 5 days, depending if that in that specific moment there is like a rush hour for them. They receive a lot of invoices. It can happen on a certain cutoff date, especially at the end of the year. But nowadays also the system of the tax office is more efficient, and then the 5 days term, is just something that is still on paper, because nowadays, I mean, the tax office is very fast on delivered invoice. What kind of checks they do? They check the minimum mandatory information required by law. It's more a formal check, like the identification of the details and the suppliers and customers, the number and date of the invoice, if the description of nature, quantity, quality of the goods or service provided is there indicated, if the taxable rate and the VAT has been correctly calculated, and as well checks also if the VAT number of the customer is really existing. Yes, and this is very important, because also in the past you can raise an invoice, put or not to put in your tax return or declare, but the client could not exist. So this is the way to avoid that. Next slide. Additional check for the is that the electronic address where to deliver the file is entered on the invoice, and unless the recipient code is there indicated, and as well the consistency of the values of the taxable amounts. There are formal checks, but if one or more of the check described above fails, I mean, the SDI discard the invoice and send the issuer a rejection receipt. So as soon as you send the invoice, your work is not finished, because you have to check constantly if the filing has done well, I mean, has reached the recipient. If not, depending on the reason of the discard, I mean, the issuer shall take some action. Next slide. By law, I mean, who issues and who received the invoice is obliged to keep electronically. But this doesn't mean just to save on PC, on your computer, or on your, I mean, cloud. This is more complex, because whatever you, in the past, you received the PDF and then you print it because you should have printed. Nowadays, if you print an electronic invoice, that paper means nothing. So if you need to go to court, or just if you receive a tax assessment in the future, you should always be able to provide the electronic invoice on an e-format. So the way of storage to archive the electronic invoice is more complex. On this topic, I mean, I have to say that the service provided by the agency revenue is very efficient. We don't use the system for creating the electronic invoice provided by the tax authorities, but we use the storage of the tax authorities because it's free, but not just for that, because it's more efficient, and you just need to make a communication, tick a box, and all the invoices are always stored there. Next slide. And why Italy introduced the invoice: for fighting tax evasion, reduce administrative costs, and reduce and speed up also the VAT compliance. Next one, please. So the level of VAT avoidance, I mean, in Italy was very high. I mean, the European Commission estimated that Italy evaded revenues of about 25.9% of the potential revenue, corresponding to about 36 billion in lost revenue for the Italian government. This is in 2016. And as you can see in the next slide, I mean, Italy is one of on the top, but top on the worst position on the countries in Europe regarding, I mean, tax evasion. Next slide. The VAT evaded can take place with or without the consent of the buyer. In this second case, I mean, the so-called evasion of omitted declaration is immediate in obtaining the billing data, as in case of the invoice, and make it possible to verify that the amount declared are consistent, and if not, to intervene immediately. In case of tax fraud, the speed of the system in detecting a suspicious transaction is particularly important. The tax authorities nowadays, until first, I said before the 1st of July 2022, I mean, Italy, it was another important change. And before that time, I mean, the Italian government was not able to, even with the presence of the invoicing, was not able to so speed up the process. But nowadays, after July 2022, I mean, every 2-3 months, I mean, the tax authority immediately send you a communication if you paid correctly the VAT. This was impossible to do in the past, because in the past, every single information provided to the tax authorities was also only at the end of the year. And nowadays, with the current communication, you can receive a note from the agency revenue also during the year. So the speeding up of the process and also detecting suspicious transaction is something that the agency revenue did a really good work. On the next slide, you can see which were, I mean, the in billion the estimation of the money that Italy can recover with that. On the next slide, you're gonna see, I mean, which are, I mean, also the advantages that the tax authorities, I mean, was promoting for introducing this new system, like less paper consumption, fewer transcription error, easy of access of information, and also the reducing of some VAT fulfillment. But you have to consider that the invoice system was a big revolution in the procedure and also in the way of working. And we say, not all that glitters is gold. So we have to face new problems due to the new error, double managing or type of transactions, and so on. And only after 2 years, we start seeing some efficiency in that. The benefit of the e-invoicing, I mean, talking on this side, on the other side, on the taxpayer side and on the tax advisor side, I mean, the clients shall not spend time in collecting and delivering invoicing to the tax accountant. We are already available, and we can collect the invoices independently from the client. We don't have to call or to push the client to send us the document, because we can collect on the website. Also, the client, they became a bit more aware of the VAT rule, because we had to train them. On the back rows, if we save time in doing something, we have to spend more time in assisting the client in how to managing the invoicing, because not all the clients are so experts in using, I mean, computers, or we have to provide additional service. And sometimes this kind of service is part of the package of the assistance that you are not paid for that. The timing of issuing and retrieving the invoices is shorter, but brings also more stress on a daily basis, because there is a kind of monitoring also due to the fact that due to the new rules, the timing for collecting and recording invoicing is shorter compared to the past. In case of an error or a mistake, that is not formal, because the formal mistakes or error are discarded directly from the SCI. I'm talking when there is a typing mistake. I use a code, a VAT code instead of another. The process, I see that the process can take a little longer, because you have to call the vendor, and then they have to create a credit note and reissue. But this is something that is part of the new package. And also another drawback, if I can say, that the XML format is very standard. So it do not support all the details and the description. So many times, further than the invoice, some vendor, especially for utilities, they continue to send the invoice also in paper, because the invoice in paper has more details. On the next slide, yes, this is, as of today, a lot of companies, they have to prepare the invoice on an electronic basis. Only non-resident companies, VAT registered in Italy, so the typical non-VAT established companies are not, for them it's not mandatory, the invoicing. And those Italian VAT subjects that use a minimum taxation regime or flat regime with a turnover up to 25,000 euro. On the next slide, in the next two slides, the invoicing, it's something that we are talking of invoicing at the European level. What is something that should be, all these systems are implemented by each country, but they not necessarily speak each other. So the good thing is that one day, all the EU member states will be able to have one whole EU invoicing system. Thank you. And the next one, and the next one is Sławomir Paciuk from Poland.
Hello, good morning to everyone. In the next few minutes, I would have the pleasure to provide you with some remarks how it looks like in Poland regarding e-invoicing. Maybe on the next slide we can see the logo of the Polish national e-invoicing system, which in Poland we set on this KSEF, KSEF. It's an abbreviation of Krajowy System e-Faktur. So this is the system which Poland implemented. And on the next slide, you can see the deadlines, because in theory, this system already works starting 2023. It's not obligatory for these taxpayers which would like to join. There is possibility to issue already the invoices in KSEF, in this e-invoicing national system. However, the obligation for almost all VAT taxpayer would exist starting 1st July 2024. After later 6 months, it would be some additional provisions related to the system introduced. For instance, they would be not possible to issue some simplified invoices in this transition period, or also the exempt VAT taxpayers would have to issue the invoices via this system, or the penalties according to the new law could be implemented starting 2025. So in practice, it means that there is less than 7 months to prepare and to introduce the new invoicing system and new system of receiving the invoices in your companies. So there's not so many time to do it, considering the processes which should be involved in this project. The first question that all taxpayers in Poland, foreign and the local one, has to answer is the question whether am I the entity which is obliged to use the KSEF. And so on the next slide, we can see which entities are obliged to do it and what kind of the transactions should be covered by these new regulations. And in practice, it means that almost all entities being VAT registered taxpayers should do it starting July next month. There is few exemptions. One of them relates to foreign entities without fixed establishment in the meaning of VAT regulations in Poland. So what foreign entities should do, they have to answer whether they have or they don't have in Poland VAT fixed establishment. In some cases, the answer is pretty simple. In many cases, it's not so obvious whether particular taxpayer has or doesn't have this fixed establishment for VAT purposes, considering the doubts and in this regard regarding to this and many court or tax rulings which were issued in the last years for foreign entities in Poland. Then generally all B2B, B2G transactions or domestic sales, also intra-community sales of goods or export or providing cross-border providing of services. All these transactions should be documented with invoices issued in this new system. In case of such transactions as import of services, import of goods, or intra-community acquisition of goods, so when the output VAT is settled by the buyer, this one are not documented with this new e-invoicing. However, there's many technical problem which entities should answer. Whether these two questions: should I be obliged to use KSEF, and what kind of transactions? For instance, in case of B2C transactions, there is no obligation to issue the invoice in KSEF. It depends a little bit on what the customer says if they would like to issue such invoice, but there is no obligation. So in practice, it means that many companies in Poland would have to issue the invoices depending on the transaction, either in the new way in KSEF or in the old school way. It means as PDF or in hard copy. On the next slide, what you can see, this is the issue related to the issuance of the invoices, which is the one issue, and also the second problem that we've got, how the invoice should be provided by the seller to the buyer. Because not all invoices and not in case of all transactions it would be works via KSEF. The Polish regulations are pretty similar to this one presented by Salvatore in Italy. So in practice, it means that if any transaction has to be documented by the e-invoice, then the taxpayer, the Polish taxpayer, the foreign taxpayer issuing such invoice would not do it anymore by his own. What would be done he would send the request to the Polish Ministry of Finance, to the server of the Polish Ministry of Finance, and all e-invoices would be issued directly by this server, by the Polish Ministry of Finance. So on the one hand, we have to prepare this draft version of the invoice, send it to the system, check whether all four this request formally is okay. There is no discrepancies, but there is just formal check. And then the invoice is issued by the server, and then let's say that it is B2B transaction between two Polish entities. We as the seller, we don't have to do anything else with this invoice. It's not needed that we would inform our buyer that such invoice is issued. What the buyer can upload can download this invoice from the server. What is problematic? The buyer wouldn't have wouldn't have received any information from the server. He has to log in and check whether any invoices have been issued on him in the last days. So in practice, there's many problems with this because there is no possibility to cancel any invoice which have been already sent. There is no possibility to send any attachments to the invoice. So what you can do, there is some if there is some cells where you can put some additional information, but no formal additional document could be sent. However, in case of some transactions, let's say intra-community sales of good, the Polish company sells the good to the German company. And on the one hand, the Polish company is obliged to issue the invoice in TCFCT. On the other hand, this invoice is issued in the server of the Polish Ministry of Finance. However, in addition, the seller, the Polish company, should provide this invoice, this visualization of this invoice to the buyer in the standard way. So the question which everybody has to answer, it's also related to how the invoice should be provided to the buyer. On the next slide, we present the complexity of the processes, because if you would like to be prepared for the TCFCT, there's few stages that you have to consider. There is many departments. It's not only the project for accountant or tax department. There is also project for many others, for legal, administration, sales, and so on, because you have to provide your employees the information who and how should invoice the invoice. How is the invoice structure? You have to check what you've got at the moment and what should you provide to the Polish Ministry of Finance starting July. You have to check what are the needs of IT department, what you've got, whether your system can work with the Polish Ministry of Finance, what new software you need. Then there is needed of implementation of this new software and instruction of and workshop for the staff. You have to verify the contracts with your contractors and check how the question related to the issuance and receiving of invoices is regulated and whether any changes are needed. So on the next slide, you can see that this project of TCFCT in Poland, it's a huge achievement for many companies. On the one hand, there's potential penalties which could be imposed on you. On the second hand, potentially it could support and support your business or your financial liquidity, because for instance, faster VAT refund would be granted for in this regard. There is also we expect that after few months, it would reduce compliance obligations, because Polish Ministry of Finance will see all invoices, which almost all invoices issued in Poland in real time. There's also one additional obligation starting 2025. If Polish entity would make any payment for e-invoice issued in the KSEF, then in the payment title in bank you have to put the number of this invoice. So it's also the challenge, and you have to check how exactly the payment mode is working in your company. On the next few slides, we presented a few open issues and achievements that you have to face it. For instance, how you would like to log in the system, who exactly in your company would have access to the system, and to which data. Because please note that the employee could see all invoices issued on the company. For instance, invoices issued by the management board, or contractors, or companies which you cooperate with. There is issue that you have to check the structure of the invoice that you've got, that you would have to have. The question related, for instance, to exchange rate, because in Poland we have to issue the VAT amount should be issued in Polish zloty, and many invoices are issued in foreign currency, which is correct, but in addition, some additional information should be provided. On the next slide, we present the following open issues related to the system, such as I mentioned by me, these attachments to the invoices. You have to discuss internally the strategies for issuing the invoices, when exactly it would be issued, when exactly this request to the Polish Ministry of Finance would be sent, who would do it, and what exactly it means for these particular transactions. So a lot of changes, a lot of achievements, and a lot of work for accounting departments and tax advisors. On this slide, you can see what areas, in case of which areas we as tax advisors and accounting company can help you with implementation of e-invoicing national system in Poland. Okay, so thank you very much for these few minutes.
Thank you, Sławomir. So just to wrap up, probably we've run over a little bit. So just quick wrap up with some closing remarks. So clearly, implementation of e-invoicing is going to be a major step in some jurisdictions for businesses operating in them. It's just interesting to hear from Italy and Poland around, the practicalities of invoices being basically uploaded to a central system and being approved through that central system and then issued. So some real practical issues for businesses to contend with. But also on the technology side, just ensuring that, if you're using, if in your country you're able to use your own kind of ERP for e-invoicing, etc., then how future-proof is that? And if you're considering implementing a new finance system in the near future, you should certainly do your due diligence around how effective that will be with respect to the implementation of e-invoicing and e-reporting in your own jurisdictions. We're going to follow this webinar up with some written pieces, a little bit more about the surveys that we've done, some of the results from those surveys. But I think the underlying theme here is for businesses just to be aware of what's happening in their own jurisdictions, and to be as prepared as possible for all the elements that they will need to factor in when implementing these new requirements. So I think that brings the webinar to a close. So thank you very much for attending, and do get in touch with any of the presenters on the webinar today with any questions that you might have on the topics which we've been discussing. Thank you very much.